Present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service, and be not fashioned according to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Welcome to True Magic, the podcast where we are learning to do spiritual service with our physical bodies by learning about the spiritual meaning encoded into the physical forms of creation. This is the second of our standalone Keystone episodes that deal with foundational issues that undergird everything that we're talking about in our regular seasonal content. Whereas the last Keystone episode was a lot of me rambling abstract thoughts at you, this one is mostly Smokey's reflections on one of the most basic patterns of symbolism. Would you like to take it away, Smokey?
Well, you say it's me, but in a way, it's just exploring one of your, as it were, liturgical catchphrases.
Well, it's you exploring one of my liturgical catchphrases.
If you happen to be the relative of a theological person, or even if you've just had a pastor who you've known for a very, very long time, you will probably know that they have these little wisdomous phrases that they like to say.
Proverbs.
Little proverbs. Sometimes to the groans of their nearest and dearest. So Bnonn's major phrases that he has personally invented, he may disagree with me on these. Everything's in Genesis.
That I have personally invented.
Yes.
Everything is in Genesis.
Generic references to morphic resonance.
Which was invented by Rupert Sheldrake.
The concept was, I don't imagine he used it as liberally as you do. I feel like at this point we have just memed it into meaninglessness.
Everything can be explained by morphic resonance. That's why I always explain everything with it.
It's a bit of a cop-out though, isn't it? It's like, I say, oh hey, something weird happened with pigeons in Chicago on the news, and you'll just be like, morphic resonance. Everything is covenant, or some covenant mentions get...
I need to develop a proper catchphrase for covenant, because it is very foundational, yes.
You like to call out when you see a covenant happening, which is more often than you would think in your defense.
Yeah.
And the other thing, I don't know if this is a catchphrase, but, fractals all the way down. Everything is fractals.
Yeah, which, in fairness, is also just kind of a slight variation on, I want to say Blake. I know too many people. I'm sorry, man whose name I am remembering as Blake, but I remember that you said everything's a body.
Fractal man.
Fractal man.
So we are, in fact, going to be discussing fractals today. Now, in case you don't know what a fractal is, because someone did ask me this the other day, a fractal is just a pattern that has the same shape when you zoom in or zoom out. So if you imagine a tree with 3 branches, and then each one of those branches splits into 3 smaller branches, and each one of those splits into 3 smaller twigs, and so on and so on. If you've ever had Microsoft Encarta, if you're old like us, they had an animation of this that was as close as you could get being a nice homeschooled Christian girl to taking psychedelic drugs. It just went on and on. It was like a Doctor Strange kind of out-of-body situation.
Doctor Strange has a lot of fractal
It does. Fractal
stuff,
fingers.
And it's funky when he goes through his big, what do you call that?
Psychedelic
ego death
thing.
Yeah.
So basically, it's a situation where you can see the pattern of the whole in the part and vice versa. It doesn't actually have to go on repeating to infinity. That's a mathematical thing. In the real world, obviously, twigs do eventually stop dividing and just, you have a tree. But we believe that God created the world in a fractal way. Now, this is true, obviously, of the natural world. You can see fractal patterns in everything from Romanesco broccoli, that really pretty stuff I grew that one year, where it's all kind of swirling.
Which was no tastier than regular broccoli, and in fact, slightly less tasty.
No, but it was more fractal, so come on.
It was more fractal.
Snowflakes, obviously, have them trees, ferns, copper crystals, apparently, and lung capillaries. So they are everywhere around us. But it's also, and more importantly, true that in the spiritual world there are fractals. That's why God created fractals in the physical world, is to point us to the spiritual fractals, which are no less real just because they're non-physical. So a man and a woman are Christ in his church. A tiny 30-person church is a microcosm of the whole body of Christ, and yet so is a 3,000-person megachurch. In the Old Testament, the most holy place was the temple, and the temple was Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was Israel. The 12 sons of Jacob didn't just originate the 12 tribes of Israel, they fractally were the 12 tribes of Israel. Prophecies are sometimes fulfilled fractally. You get a little bit now and then a larger version later.
Prophecies are often fulfilled fractally. I'd say that that's actually the norm for understanding prophecy. And when you understand the fractal nature of how God works, it no longer seems like an arbitrary thing that you're getting these multiple fulfillments of prophecy going on.
Interesting.
It just makes sense. Like, oh, of course there would be an immediate fulfillment and then a later fulfillment that looks bigger.
So a good rule of thumb for examining whether an idea that you might have is just and sane is to ask, will it fractal? Will it be bearable, scaled all the way up or all the way down? Would you be willing to live in it at both of its extremes?
This isn't just a question to ask about intriguing abstract theological patterns like prophecies or the building of the temple. Symbolism is intriguing and abstract, but it is also useful and practical when we get it right, at least. If symbolism is the physical expression of spiritual realities, then getting it right is literally to impress heaven upon earth, and getting it wrong is to impress the other thing upon earth. So it's important to get it right. So let's take a really serious, extreme example, which is a reasonably good example of impressing the other thing on earth. Let's apply this fractal sanity, so to speak, sanity test, to something with real-world ramifications that have been relevant for the past century or more and resulted in hundreds of millions of deaths and still cause a huge amount of suffering and injustice today. In fact, is arguably the leading cause of the West's collapse. Let's ask, will it fractal about politics, and especially communism?
Communism definitely does not pass the fractal test. At first blush, and in its purest and most theoretical form, if you think of, spherical communism in a vacuum, perhaps it does. A family has members who give according to their abilities and take according to their needs. We don't expect a baby or a 90-year-old blind grandmother to work the way a strapping young 25-year-old son would.
And the fact that you can take that, as you say, spherical in a vacuum communism and think that you can apply that in real life is the reason that it continues to be a problem. We continue to be plagued by it because of theoretical communism.
Yeah, because it's a nice idea.
It's a nice idea, and nobody goes any further than that. But if you think fractally...
Yeah, when you see how communism actually works, forced redistribution, we can easily see how even in the loving bonds of a family, which theoretically forgive much, working harder for no personal benefit will sap the will of a worker. It won't take 15-year-old Johnny Long to notice that he does no better from hoeing 50 rows of beans than his 8-year-old brother Ben does from mowing 10, or that if Johnny slackens off to 40 rows of beans, his dinner will not immediately diminish. And we can see this even more clearly as we fractal up. So in a slightly larger society, in an isolated neighborhood or village, or among a group shipwrecked on a desert island where ties are weaker, people will grow increasingly impatient of those who will not work. And if need grows dire, they will grow increasingly intolerant of those who cannot. Every group survival movie has that moment where people have to decide if they're going to shoot the guy with the broken leg who's just lying there drinking all the water, to say nothing of the guy who's privately hoarding all the chocolate bars.
We can extend this out beyond the core principles of communism to something that always seems to go along with communism, which is the spreading of bureaucracy. Admittedly, a problem in perhaps all kinds of government, but especially in machine types of government that depersonalize and decentralize the state. So applying the fractal rule of a farming household needs plenty of workers and only one or two managers, if the ratios of our overloaded bureaucratic system were applied at that scale, the farm would become an office block and the fields would go essentially untilled and unplanted, although possibly thoroughly catalogued.
Or let's go out further to society in general. Why are so many of our cities dying and unlivable? Because they have been scaled non-fractally. If you think of the smallest unit, right, a household, it has separate areas for separate tasks, of course, but they're close enough that you can easily get between them. The herb garden has to be close to the kitchen, and the bathroom must be near the bedrooms and so forth. Now, fractaling up, a neighbourhood also needs to have separate areas, obviously, people's homes and so on, but things have to be close enough still for convenience. The playground should be as close as possible to the houses where the toddlers live, and the corner store should be, well, just around the corner. So the most livable and lovable cities tend to be those which aren't built like one giant house sized up, or even one giant neighbourhood sized up, with all the offices in one place, the business district, and all the malls in another place, the shopping district, and all the houses in another, which are the suburbs, a nasty commute right away, and then all the ugly light industrial sprawl in its own personal urban hellscape, unrelieved by cafes or parks or places that might enrich the soul. The best cities are instead a collection of neighbourhoods. They're individually delightful mixed-use suburbs which are walkable, workable in, and don't have to be artificially sustained with life support missions to the big smoke.
Which is important when you're thinking about how to scale fractally. What you're not trying to do is just create a much bigger version of what you've already got.
Yeah, Ant-Man isn't fractal.
Yeah,
he doesn't
Ant-Man
fractal.
is not fractal. Right.
He just swells and becomes gargantuan and grotesque.
Right. Generally speaking, a fractal takes the pattern and it replicates that pattern outwards, but it does it by repeating the pattern, not just by making the pattern bigger in one single leap.
Yeah. And to go in a slightly different direction, one of the evils of colonialism is that the British Empire treated its colonies with an extractive mentality, called extractive colonies, and they were the spice larders and the diamond mines and the sugar factories of the mother country. Since they weren't treated as whole entities in their own right, but these grotesquely disproportionate limbs for a specific purpose, they could not function correctly when they gained independence. The British had obviously a very paternalistic attitude to its colonies. I mean, it's in the name mother country. And even the more benign elements tended to believe that native populations were childlike and needed to be raised to maturity by European civilization. But they didn't raise them as you would raise a child, because you would want a child to eventually be whole and independent. It's as if you raised a child only to fetch water and chop wood, and perform only the basic functions necessary to his continued ability to fetch water and chop wood forever, as if his whole life would thereafter consist of needing to do nothing but gather water and chop wood. It's common for people to say, oh, well, India wanted independence, but even after the British left all that lovely technology behind and such a good example of getting things done, they kind of couldn't hack it by themselves. But the Indians were very good at what they did. They'd just been well trained to be a piece of a puzzle, not a whole puzzle. And that is, people wonder why so many countries fell apart because of colonialism. It wasn't just racism. It wasn't sort of just that their indigenous ways had been destroyed, some of which should have been destroyed because they were straight up evil. It was very largely this extractive thing, where they were not given the dignity of wholeness. It was like reverse parasitism. It was like Britain was parasitic on them and they were just this sort of appendage to do their one thing.
I think you see that reflected in the attitude of a lot of the people that were left behind as well. They didn't actually want to solve the problems and work on the technology that was left behind because they had a lot of resentment about how they had essentially just been used.
Yeah. And it'll happen again, if we ever colonize the moon. Is the colony on the moon going to be for Earth? Are we going there so that we can take the minerals from the moon and give them back to Earth? But then after a few generations, when they have developed their own identity, their own sort of, their language will develop, they'll have their own culture, and they might start to feel like, actually, we don't want to exist just to serve you. We want to be whole in our own right. So, how, will we be able to fractal colonizing the moon?
Or however you say that in Moonese.
Exactly. And of course, it's sobering to think how many countries nowadays are doing this to themselves. We're doing it here in New Zealand. We are not self-sufficient in any useful sense. And we have great land. We can do agriculture. We can do dairy. But we're not making most of the stuff we need. And many countries, including ourselves, are not only outsourcing all our manufacture of stuff, but also our manufacture of citizens, because we can't even grow our own populations.
The fractal rule of thumb can also be salutary when thinking of our own households, since as goes the household, so goes society.
See, there's another catchphrase of yours.
That was Michael's.
All right.
Suppose you've got 7 children, and the 3 boys never learned to cook because their sisters were so fond of cooking. Now, scaled up, is that a society you would want to live in? One in which the boys, in general, can't cook? If not, why are you perpetuating a society that you don't like? It may not matter in your household, but it's perpetuating an unhealthy pattern. And of course, the boys won't always be in your household. Be the change you want to see in the world, people.
Yes, but of course, like all things, there are ditches. You can go too far. Specialization is not wrong. And if a family is unusually musical, that doesn't mean they expect all of society to neglect other pursuits in favor of music too.
Or that they need to neglect their musical gifts in order to be more like normal society.
Exactly. In fact, a certain imbalance of gifts and talents is baked into God's design. An eye has to wholeheartedly commit to being an eye, instead of spending half the week dutifully trying to be a foot for the sake of being well-rounded.
Right. Fractals are actually, so this is another important point, fractals are actually the balancing of unity and plurality or multiplicity. They're the proper ordering of the one and the many. If you only have unity, you can't have a fractal. That's your Ant-Man. Because there's only one thing to begin with. There's no larger pattern, just a monad. And the monad, you can make the monad bigger, but you haven't got a fractal then. You've just got a bigger monad. So an eye can't contain an eye. Only a body can contain an eye. It has to be made up of other things. A body is a pattern that can be repeated fractally in the sense that you can add multiple bodies together and you get a new kind of body, a corporate body, a family, a household, or a church, or whatever. An eye isn't like that. When you see eyes repeated at different levels of reality, that's because they are part of different sizes of bodies. For instance, the espionage apparatus of a state is a kind of an eye attached to the body of the nation. So you can't have nothing but unity, but you also can't have nothing but multiplicity. If there's just infinite variety, a non-repeating set of diverse things with no commonality between them, then again, a fractal is impossible. Pi is not fractal, it's an irrational number, it never repeats. So over-specialization yields excessive oneness, and overgeneralization yields excessive multiplicity, and fractals balance those two things.
I feel like there's got to be some deep insight here about the Trinity.
Oh, this is 100% based on the Trinity.
Do you want to expand on that?
I don't.
Can you expand on that?
No.
No, fair enough.
Hence, someday.
Yeah. Which means that as a fractal yourself, because you yourself are a body, you also have to know how to balance speciality and generalization, one and many. And this depends somewhat on your place in the larger fractals of the social bodies you're part of. As a body yourself, you have to be, to some extent, well-rounded, which is to say complete or whole. You have to be able to groom yourself, you have to be able to get yourself from A to B, or feed yourself at a basic level, know how to read and write. You have to be able to do a lot of things as a human. But as a member of a family body, you can be more specialized. You can be the organized one who plans the birthday parties, or the tidy one who cleans the kitchen, or the one who's always building things in the back shed. And as a member of your larger community body, you can be even more specialized. You can be a corporate accountant, or something as specific as the man who machines steel rods for going in earth-moving equipment. Modern civilization is insanely specialized.
And the fact that as you become more developed as a body, the individual bodies within are able to specialize is also significant. The definition of civilization is the ability to specialize because the farmers are taking care of enough food for everyone.
Yes.
If you have a non-civilized body where everyone has to work at making their own food,
operating purely on a subsistence level, yeah.
Yeah. What you have essentially is a very underdeveloped body. You haven't actually developed your body to the point that you can now start to specialize and focus in on the oneness in order to increase the diversity of the body. If you think about the way that God has made different types of organisms, you've got really basic organisms like worms, which have far less specialization within their bodies than ours do. They've got less differentiation within their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Our bodies have greater levels of differentiation, which allows us to do far more things and be far more versatile and far more, we would say in the modern world, advanced. And that's the same thing that you see with corporate bodies.
You don't have to feel racist about saying we're more advanced than worms. It's okay.
I wasn't feeling racist. I was feeling enlightened.
Okay.
But the general idea is that, you've got corporate bodies, and as the corporate body develops civilization, what you're essentially seeing is the fulfillment or the completion of the human body in its corporate aspect. So you've got sufficient differentiation within the individual bodies now in their specialization, in their oneness, that you can actually have that multiplicity expanding out and creating a better kind of corporate body.
Right, and then you've got the dark side of that, which is the Ford assembly line, where people are so specialized that they do one tiny thing which becomes meaningless because they never get to sort of participate in the whole mission, and that very much diminishes people's humanity.
Because they're no longer properly integrated into the whole body.
Yeah.
They don't have a sufficient view or a sufficient connection to all of the other things that the body is doing. They're siloed off, and they've kind of become like an eye that only sees, not even for the sake of itself. It's like it only sees for the sake of some other body part that never gives anything back.
Now, in the same way, as a member of your local church, you can be specialized to some degree. You might be the woman who always invites visitors home after the service, or you might be the go-to guy for answering tricky questions about bioethics. And then going up a level, fractaling up, your entire church as a member of the universal church can be somewhat specialized also. Maybe your local body is particularly good at symbolism, or at outreach ministry, or at finessing the fine points of systematic theology, or at producing solid families with believing children, or even just being really good singers. I think it's obvious that certain churches, and in fact certain denominations and entire theological traditions, have certain strengths and weaknesses. And there can be rest in the knowledge of this fractal system. Your tiny blue-collar church may never be able to display the glory of God by reverently building a cathedral out of stone and skill, and that's okay. Your job might be to make killer casseroles for the potluck, and you may do that very well.
If you're a Baptist.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of danger in losing sight of the fractal nature of bodies, thinking that you're the one true church, or your way is the only way. Casseroles are actually the only way that Christians are allowed to eat now. Obviously, there's some sense in which there really are right and wrong doctrines and right and wrong ways of doing things. But the accelerating fracturing of Western civilization, I think, owes a lot to the mindset that has lost the ability to discern the larger body. We've essentially become like that worker on the production line, but with churches. And I think that the Reformed mindset is probably the worst for this, because everything is about doctrinal precision. it produces a mindset that can't take in the larger body. It can't conceive that the body as a whole could contain serious error. And so it reduces the whole body to only the part that is most acceptable to the purist.
It certainly would be wonderful to sort of, I think C.S. Lewis talks about this, have the low church man being grateful to the high church man for what his tradition represents and gives, and says, hey, it's not my thing, but it's valuable. I'm glad someone's doing it, and vice versa. And, to say to the charismatics, look, we're not you, but it's wonderful that you have enthusiasm and that you believe so fervently in the Holy Spirit. And, so forth.
And if you actually had everyone taking a fractal view, there would be a lot more cooperation between the different types of body parts, if you think of denominations as body parts. There would be some effort being made to find integrating principles that would start to draw them together in ways that would attenuate their excesses.
Yes.
And bring what is good about them into the whole body so that everyone would benefit from them. Instead of, again, everyone being siloed off and sort of separated out, and you get the body being cut up and no longer able to function as a whole.
Fortunately, fractals can help us to sort out these kinds of questions. They can also help us to evaluate moral problems or root out our own hypocrisy. To take a softer target for a moment, I find it very intriguing that the left is so vehemently against eugenics when it's mandated by the state, but extremely pro when the issue is of a single woman deciding that she doesn't have the capacity to care for a child with Down syndrome or spina bifida or microcephaly. Of course, this is eugenics. It's just on a small scale. It's fractal down. Often these are wanted planned pregnancies in which if the child were healthy, the woman would be delighted to bring it into the world. The disability is literally the only reason the child is condemned to death. And somehow that's the loving, empowering choice. But if the government does it to another unwanted disabled person, say even if it's someone in an institution with no family, that's horrendous. The implication is that strangers have a higher responsibility to care for a disabled person than that disabled person's own parent does, even temporarily, since adoption after birth is always an option. This just clearly doesn't track.
I'm actually not sure if that is the implication, at least not in the way that they're thinking.
Okay.
I think that obviously that is the implication because ultimately strangers are going to be looking after it. But what the actual implication is that the state has to be a better mother than an individual mother can be. So what you're actually seeing is an intuitive application of a fractal pattern in a perverse way where they're seeing individual mothers can't do this. They don't have this capacity, but the state is the supreme mother. The state must always be able to have the capacity.
I feel like it's partly just a sort of, as long as the responsibility is diffused, it is not tyrannical.
Absolutely.
So it's a tyranny to make a mother care for her baby, but if you make everybody care for everyone's baby sort of in a vague, generic, removed way through coerced funding,
and they're not unrelated ideas.
Yeah.
It's using the fractal nature of society to diffuse away
yes.
responsibility.
Yes. But now that disability advocacy has become a big thing and it's sort of mutant twin disability pride, you do occasionally see people getting really squeamish about this and questioning it. I've seen this online. They can see the fractal and they don't like it because it has been drilled into them from day one that what the Nazis did was monstrous and what a pregnant woman does is sacrosanct. And yet, the pattern is glaringly obvious.
I'm pretty sure that referring to disability pride as a mutant twin is a hate crime. And we're now going to be censored from all the major podcast applications. And
on which we were doing so well.
We were doing excellently, but this is the end.
Okay, dokies. Well, fun while it lasted.
Anyway, going back to empowering choices and judging the larger body versus the individual. If you want to, for example, tut about the problem of obesity in your country. You've got an obese nation, but also you're obese. Well, you're the problem. It fractals down to you. Or if you're complaining about over-tourism when you're on holiday, or you're complaining about traffic while you're driving, which is something that I believe we have all done, well, you get the idea. You're part of the problem. The pattern of reality cycles upward and downward onto us, and the bodies that we're most tightly integrated into are patterns of our own bodies. So if we don't like how reality is looking right now, especially at the larger scales, the first and often the only thing that we can do is to work at reforming the bodies closest to us.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very simple thing. It's just sort of a hypocrisy check. But it can be a helpful way to think about it, I think, because we're all so prone to being like, nobody reads anymore. When is the last time we read a book? Unclear.
I read a book just yesterday.
Well done.
I didn't finish it.
If only society were more like you. If nothing else, it can be a good exercise in humility to stop and thank God that the whole world does not look like we do. that our household, our personal discipline, our temperament hasn't been fractaled up to engulf society. That God has had the grace to limit our scope in a manner that limits, frankly, the damage that our sin can do. And this is why the elders of the church have to be above reproach. This is why judges must be godly men. The more power and influence someone has, the more his morality will fractal. This is, in fact, one of the reasons Bnonn had grave concerns about the election of Trump. A man incapable of being faithful and honest in the small things, like running his own household, or the medium-sized things, like running a business, should not be fractaled up to running the free world because his tendencies will inevitably begin to fractal down to the people. People talk about trickle-down economics. How about fractal-down morality? Fractal-down levels of discourse? Fractal-down regard for truth?
And if we're thinking about ways to reform, we should also be asking, will this fractal? Or are we just replacing one perverse or unsustainable mode of being with another that is more convenient to us? Not only should we be asking, will it fractal? We should be asking, will it not fractal? Are we trying to implement a system that is so top-down and centralized that it doesn't have subsidiarity? And if you don't know what subsidiarity is, you can go to Exodus 18, and there you will find it. Because if we don't have subsidiarity, that's a huge red flag. Fractals are supposed to happen. You're supposed to have a pyramid structure. You're supposed to have commanders of tens and fifties and hundreds and thousands.
Well, that covers the basic idea. The applications and implications are as far-reaching as fractals themselves, but this is as far as we're going to try to go in this episode.
If you have questions or further insights, the place that you want to be is our True Magic Signal group with our Trooms, which you can join as a paid supporter at truemagic.nz. Until next time, continue to present your bodies as living sacrifices, which is your spiritual service. This has been True Magic.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.